we made it. It is the end of 2025. I feel like it has been a long year. Do you feel like it has been a long year? But here we are. So let's talk about the best books of the year. I am Allison. Welcome to my BookTube channel. This video is about the 7 books I read this year that I gave 9 or 10 stars. Starting out, we have Lost Cat by Mary Gaitskill. This is a memoir, sort of a memoirette. It's only maybe 100 pages long, about the author's lost cat. She goes to Italy with her husband. She's like a professor, and they go to Italy over the summer, and she finds this tiny kitten and she brings it home with her, and then the kitten runs away and, is presumably dead, although she spends the entire book looking for the kitten, so who knows. But what's really interesting about the search for the kitten is that the author uses it as a way to work through grief that she has about other things happening in her life that she hasn't really been able to access. I think it's just sometimes emotions are too big and too much for our brain, and we can't look at that because we just aren't ready to look at it. And so this experience of this lost cat really helps her unlock some of the feelings of loss and rejection and fear that she has had in other situations throughout her life. And the main situation that she discusses really in depth is the relationship that she has built with these 2 children from sort of difficult circumstances that came to her house one summer as part of a program to get kids from inner cities living in difficult situations in inner cities out to the country to essentially just give them some fresh air and space and, time to be kids. And she participates in this program and hosts these kids and develops this really interesting relationship with them. She's white and the kids are Latino, and they have a sort of difficult home life. I mean, both in terms of their moms, they live with their mom. I think she's a single mother, and their financial circumstances are quite difficult, but also, their mother is not a super well-adjusted person. Like, she's had a difficult life and, is sort of in a generational trauma kind of way, taking it out on these kids. And Mary Gaitskill, lives this very privileged, protected life on this farm with her middle-class husband, and she, both feels very emotionally connected to these kids, but also struggles a lot to bridge the real serious sort of race and class barriers between them because they just have such different life perspectives. And she wants to help them, but it's sort of limited what she can really do because obviously they're not her kids, and she's not their mom. They have a mom, they have a family and a life. She can't just drop in and fix these kids' lives, that's just not how life works. And so, she really struggles with sort of feelings of helplessness and rejection and loss. And she, uses the metaphor of this lost cat, or the experience of this lost cat, to really reach in and sort of process her feelings about those relationships. And I really liked this book because it felt very tight. It's a short book. It's doing essentially 2 things max. It really is just talking about how do we process grief? How do we process our emotions? How do we confront these difficult things in life? And, and doing it in a way where the metaphor is pretty obvious, but it really works. And it's a very kind of no frills book, but I found it very emotionally affecting. And, to be able to do that in such a small number of pages is really impressive. And I enjoyed it. I think the characters are really sympathetic, and, you really can understand the various perspectives in play and how they would not see things eye to eye. You can really understand where person A is coming from and person B is coming from, and still understand how they totally can't understand where each other are coming from. And yeah, and I just thought it was really well done. You know, Mary Gaitskill is a really good writer. And so I gave that book a 9 out of 10. The second book on the list is Second Place by Rachel Cusk. And I should say some of these books I have with me, but many of them I have lent to friends, or I have a little free library in my front yard. And so I, you know, circle through a lot of books. I don't like to keep very many books. I don't have like giant bookshelves. I really like to sort of get any potential clutter sort of out of my life before it can become clutter. And so I only hang on to books that I really, really love. So anyways, so some of these I have, and some of them I don't have the physical copies anymore. But I do actually have, I'm gonna use this as a stand-in. I've outlined by Rachel Cusk because I really, really liked Second Place. And so, you know, going into next year, I'm definitely gonna be reading some more Rachel Cusk. So, Second Place is a short novel about a woman and her husband who live on a farm. Actually, literally so many of these are about a woman and her husband who live on a farm. I don't know what's going on with that. Maybe like my subconscious secretly wishes I lived on a farm. I don't know. But she and her husband have this second house, a guest house, that they use as a sort of artist in residence house. And they will invite, you know, musicians and artists and writers to come stay in their guest house and just, you know, work on their art. Basically, the woman used to live in the city and be sort of in the art scene, and she misses that connection to art and culture. And so she likes to, have people who are kind of in it come and, you know, just like spice up life a little bit. And they, you know, it's this like beautiful marsh. One of the things about the book that's really nice is the way that the setting plays such a role. It's such a vividly described setting, and it really plays a role in setting the stage for the story. You know, you can feel how the way that Rachel Cusk describes these marshes, you can really feel how they were like so beautiful, but also so isolated, and how that, you know, lends itself to sort of meditation, but also to sort of overthinking. And, you know, and all of that really plays out in the main character. And basically they invite one summer, I guess, this painter who the main character really likes. And he's just kind of trouble, right? He's kind of a Lothario, and he brings with him this like young sort of muse, and the wife is a little bit sort of attracted to him, but he treats her with sort of scorn, and he wants to paint the portraits of everyone else but her, and she feels very rejected by that. And it's just basically a book about sort of, I think, has two main themes that it really plays with. The first one is the connection between art and an artist, right? You know, the main character is really having to process the fact that she loves this painter and has been so excited to have him come because she feels so connected to his work. She feels like the work really speaks to her, and she expects that when, you know, he arrives in the flesh, that they will just be so simpatico immediately. And then it turns out he's like he doesn't like her at all, and he is so mean to her, and they just aren't connecting. And she's so thrown by this experience of really feeling like, you know, this person's art speaks to her, and then just feeling completely disconnected to the person. And then the other theme it plays with is sort of beauty and attraction and aging. And that is also really fun. It deals with these characters, the artist who used to be really young and hot and is kind of getting older, and then, you know, being here with this middle-aged couple, and the woman's sort of perceptions of herself and beauty, and, you know, her feelings of rejection by this artist, even though she's like happily married and, you know, and is sort of well into middle age, all of the sort of just comedy essentially that there is around the way that aging impacts people's views of themselves and self-esteem, and the way that they treat other people. And, you know, you get to sort of see this artist. There's like some sort of flash forwards where you get to see this artist as, you know, he is even older, and the sort of, I don't know, the sort of, I guess, grotesque comedy of people who are unwilling to let go of youth, you know, who are sort of in denial about the fact that human beings age and die, and the lengths that people will go to delude themselves about that. And yeah, and so I just found all of that really fun. It is a book full of characters that I mostly didn't like. It's, you know, it's sort of the woman and her husband who are somewhat, she's like pretty sympathetic. The husband is very sympathetic. And then this artist who's pretty unsympathetic, and his muse who's like kind of confusing. And then the adult daughter of the protagonist who, you know, has this tricky adult daughter-mother relationship with the protagonist, and you know, won't let her in, and the protagonist is very frustrated and stymied by that. And then the adult daughter has this horrible boyfriend that she's brought, you know, and so it's this collection of people who are mostly terrible and terrible to each other, and yet it feels very human. Like, it feels like they are being very human to each other in a way that is very lovely, and, you know, sort of set against this insanely beautiful natural backdrop. And so I really, really enjoyed that book as well. Rachel Cusk is a great writer. Her prose is so beautiful to read. It is such a pleasant experience existing inside this story, even as all this like sort of weird and awkward stuff is happening. You know, just the way that she describes things is so lovely. And I will definitely be reading more Rachel Cusk. I gave that a 9 out of 10 as well. Okay, the next book I actually have. It is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. Now, I know this book has been kind of controversial. I've seen a lot of people online who really did not like this book. And I am very sympathetic to that, because this book is very boring. It's slow, it's meandering, it doesn't really go anywhere. But for me, that was the beauty of it. This is a book about a young woman who is the daughter of Turkish immigrants, and she matriculates at Harvard for her freshman year. And reading this book feels like being in college again. It is uncanny. You know, it's Selin's experience of just wandering around and kind of doing a little bit of nothing. She goes to classes, you know, she lives with 2 roommates in the dorms who don't get along, and she has to sort of navigate their weird interpersonal conflicts, and, you know, everybody's parents trying to move them in and not totally getting along, and, you know, then leaving the kids to deal with the fallout of that. And, you know, Selin not understanding like what's cool, what makes something cool. One of her roommates really wants her to get a particular poster, and Selin goes to the little bookstore sale to get a poster but gets the wrong one, and then the roommate wants her to kind of like hide it behind the desk, and then it's like on Selin's side of the room, and people always think it's Selin's poster, and they're like, oh no, like, don't, you know, did you know that actually that poster has this connotation? And she's like, you know, and she just is trying to defend something that she doesn't even care about or know anything about. And yeah, and she just, you know, she thinks all these deep thoughts about the world, but many of them are sort of deep in this sort of fake deep way that, you know, that like you just are thinking and writing in college. You know, you feel like things are so profound, but when you really take a step back, it's like, what even is that? Like, that's nothing, you know? There's this part where she's like musing on the fact that a tissue box and a book are both like thin sheets of paper inside of thick cardboard, but they have like very different functions, you know, and it's like, that's just nothing. Like, but it's presented through her perspective as this, like, you know, as her like meditation on the world, and it's so funny. And she, you know, gets into a sort of situationship with this guy who's a senior, and she's just very confused by him, and he has a girlfriend but is still kind of acting like he likes her, and she just doesn't know, you know, she won't ever just ask him, and she doesn't really know what to do about it or how she feels about it. And, you know, her friends are always asking her about it, and she doesn't know what to say. And yeah, it's just, and then she goes on this crazy study abroad to like this rural village in Hungary, and everybody's just really excited to meet an English speaker, and so they like make her do all this really ridiculous stuff, you know, go on these like funny little like cultural experience trips, and like, you know, live with these people, and, you know, just all of these sort of hilarious nonsense things that happen to you when you're young and figuring it out, and just trying things, you know, just like learning by trial and error, because you just have no experience and buckets of time. And so you really can just trial and error your way through. And yeah, and it's just great. It's just so funny. And I just really, really enjoyed every minute of it. And I gave this a 9 out of 10 as well. Okay, the last 9 out of 10 book before we move up to the real heavy hitters was Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. I love Ann Patchett. I read her for the first time this year and I'm obsessed. Tom Lake it's got this lovely sort of old Hollywood, like, you know, Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo kind of vibe to it, where this woman and her husband who live on a cherry farm, because of course it's a book about a woman and her husband who live on a farm. They are home for COVID and their 3 adult daughters come home over COVID. And the husband lets it slip that the wife used to date this famous actor. And most of the story is the wife, the mom, telling the story of her sort of youth as an up-and-coming actress and her fling with this now famous actor. And it's, you know, jumps back and forth between sort of the really lovely snapshot in time that the mother is having with her 3 daughters home during COVID. Obviously, the daughters are not having that same lovely experience. Like, they're feeling really stressed about the fact that they have lives that they want to be getting on with, and, you know, they can't, you know, move their relationships and their careers forward, and they're worried about all the things they're missing out on. Totally understandable. That's how I felt during COVID. But, you know, but the mom is just so thrilled to just get this time with them. And, you know, so that's sort of a funny dynamic. And then, but most of the story is about the mom's sort of starting in high school when she auditions for like a community theater play, to basically getting discovered and then being in a movie, and then going sort of, while the movie is waiting to be released, going to a sort of summer theater place where famous actors and up-and-coming actors essentially try to get discovered, but also sort of just keep their skills sharp and meet each other and get some practice. And it's, you know, absolutely beautiful. It's like, you know, there's tennis courts in this beautiful lake, and they're just running around and swimming and playing tennis and drinking all day, and, you know, just having this lovely sort of summer with all these other beautiful, you know, beautiful people, actors and dancers and whatever. And that's basically the book. You know, it's just about the mom's sort of early career trajectory, and then the sort of choices she makes where she, you know, doesn't end up becoming a famous actress. Instead, she ends up, you know, working on this cherry farm. And the book is, it's not that deep, I have to say. You know, this is a book that is just, it's just beautiful. You know, it's well written. The relationships feel quite meaningful. One criticism I will say, the daughters feel a bit young for how old they're supposed to be. And the mom's, there's a point where the mom thinks to herself, you know, the mom character thinks to herself, when the daughters come home, they seem to sort of revert to their like teenage selves. And so, you know, that I suppose sort of explains it. But the daughters do feel a little unrealistically too young, you know, like they're sort of like clambering to hear this, you know, just like further installments of this long sort of drawn out story that the mom is telling. And, you know, and they're supposed to be like, you know, 25 and a doctor kind of thing, you know? So it's like when they're acting like 16-year-olds, it is a little bit like, what? Okay, fine. You know, maybe they're reverting to their teenage selves, but it just feels a little weird. But other than that, it's just such a lovely world to exist in, you know, the beautiful cherry trees and just spending time outside in the sun and this sort of family being together. And then combined with this very kind of glitzy, fun, carefree youth that the mother had, you know, just like going around and being in plays and being in movies. And, you know, one thing about it that was really sort of fun and lovely is that she wasn't like struggling and, you know, and dreaming and scraping and being exploited, like, you know, like as so many people are. She just sort of, you know, bumbles around and gets these experiences. And, you know, it turns out she's like really good at playing this one character and then is sort of like a mediocre actor otherwise. But, you know, nobody knows that until she's already sort of cast in this thing, and she's just kind of going around having a nice time. It read a little bit like Patti Smith's memoir, Just Kids, where she says, you know, that in the sort of early stages of her experiences in New York, she's like, you know, I was just like sleeping on park benches and doing drugs and going to random places with random people. And, you know, I didn't know what I was doing, and I wasn't really being like self-protective, and it just, you know, by some sort of grace of God, everything just kind of worked out and it was fine. And I like ended up with this, you know, sort of career in life. It's kind of nice sometimes to just read something where it's not heavy. It's just this sort of nice, light little Hollywood flashback kind of story. And yeah, so anyways, I really, really loved it. I gave it a 9 out of 10. And I will say, by contrast, the first 10 out of 10 book on my list is also by Ann Patchett, and that is The Dutch House. This book is amazing. It is that deep. You know, it is a beautifully written book, and it's a wonderful world to exist in. You know, Ann Patchett's writing is, I mean, just stunning. Really stripped down and spare, but still so evocative. It's just wonderful. And this story is really compelling. It is about a brother and a sister, a younger brother and an older sister. It's told from the perspective of the younger brother, who, after their father dies, basically his new wife kicks them out of their childhood home, which is this like insane, elaborate, fancy Dutch style house that their father had bought when he had sort of become financially successful, that their late mother had hated, and she then sort of shortly passed away. And it starts out being about their childhood and sort of, you know, their experiences living in this house. And then it quickly transitions into being their experiences after being banished from the house. And it follows them basically their entire lives, from, you know, childhood through being college students, through growing up, getting jobs, getting married, and, you know, and eventually, you know, quite far through their lives. And the book focuses on the building up of layers of memories and layers of significance, sort of looking back on experiences. So one of the sort of recurring motifs, I don't know if motif is quite the right word, but right after they're first kicked out of the house, they, you know, start sort of just parking across the street and looking at the house and basically just talking. You know, it's just like an opportunity for them to sort of reminisce about the house and, you know, meditate on what they've lost, but also be together. And they keep that up throughout the rest of the book. But as they get older, it's like the experience of sitting in the car starts to have less and less to do with looking at this life they've lost, and more to do with remembering all of their relationship that's been built sitting in this car. And that is one of the big kind of, not questions, but issues that the book is sort of wrestling with. You know, the way that we, every time we think back on our memories, we're like a little bit of a different person, you know? And so our memories will look different to us in 5 years than they do now. And yet, you know, that memory is part of my identity, right? It's like part of building my identity. And so you end up with this sort of interesting cycle where as I change, the way that I perceive my memories changes, and that, you know, in some ways like changes me even more. And so it's just a really interesting meditation on what it is to grow up, and, you know, what it is to be someone, you know, and, you know, and yet to be all these different someones over the course of your life. And it also deals with some really interesting questions about the expectations that we have for people and for ourselves. So one thing that happens is that the younger brother has basically a college fund that their father set aside for him, and he uses it to go to medical school. Originally more because they're just, the siblings are mad and are trying to just use up the money, because whatever they don't use, I think, reverts back to the wife, you know, to their stepmom, who has kicked them out of the house. And then he becomes a doctor and gets married to this woman who is really excited to be married to a doctor. And then it turns out he doesn't really want to be a doctor. And then he has to sort of deal with the the process of disappointing his wife, who, you know, sort of wanted to be a doctor's wife, and, you know, what that sort of does to both of them. You know, that her finding out essentially that you know, he wasn't really the person she thought he was, and him finding out how much of her attachment to him was from this sort of fantasy she had of like being a doctor's wife. And, you know, there's also the sister plays a really interesting relationship in the brother's relationship to his wife, because the wife sort of blames a lot of what she perceives as her husband's negative characteristics on the sister. And so it's also really interesting the way that, you know, that these people's perceptions of each other, the wife's perception of her husband, is filtered through what she thinks is the sister's impact, you know, and that may or may not be true, right? It may be that some of that is just who he is, and she's attributing it to the sister, you know, because that's easier than coming to terms with the fact that like your husband has all these qualities you're not that into. And yeah, it's just really, really interesting meditation on who we are as people and how we change over our lives and how other people perceive us and how that sort of changes us or doesn't change us. And all of that, you know, in just an absolutely stunning prose. So this is a 10 out of 10. I would highly, highly recommend it. I absolutely loved this book. The next 10 out of 10 was The Safekeep by Yael van der Wouden. This, I think, is a debut novel, and I could definitely tell that. There are sort of ways in which it's a little bit awkward, like it's still sort of finding its sea legs, but it's so good. And it's good because it is just absolutely unhinged. So this book is a suspense, thriller, erotic, sapphic romance, Holocaust novel. And it proceeds in 3 parts, and every part is like you get whiplash. Like they feel like a totally different book in sort of tone and, you know, the like way that the sort of way that the characters are presented. It's like crazy, but it's so good. It's so fun. It deals with basically this woman named Isabel who lives alone in her family home. Her parents have died and her 2 brothers have moved out, and they like basically moved to the city and don't want to live in this sort of country home. And so she lives, you know, even though I think it's like their uncle owns the house and eventually it will pass to her older brother, but in the meantime, she lives there and takes care of it. And then her brother, and she's a little, they don't exactly say, you know, but like sort of neurospicy. Like she's not very good with people. She's not very good with change. She's very fixed in her routines and feels very like threatened by breaks in her routines. And some of that is like from sort of childhood trauma, in response to sort of childhood trauma from World War II and the Holocaust. She's not, this book takes place in the Netherlands and she's not Jewish. She's like, I guess Christian, but she, you know, she's like a Dutch person, but they were invaded by the Nazis, and it like was really traumatic for a lot of people. And so she, you know, has these sort of traumatic childhood experiences that she is still not recovered from. And her brother basically tells her that he is letting his new girlfriend stay with her for a couple of weeks over the summer and in the house. And so the first part of this book really feels like a sort of suspense thriller, where this, you know, this like invasion of this new person into Isabel's settled life. And, you know, Isabel doesn't know her and suspects her motives and feels like she's sort of got a facade up and is, you know, really is like playing a role but doesn't really match the role. And so, you know, the first part is like very antagonistic. Like the 2 women don't like each other and Isabel doesn't want her there and doesn't, you know, is like very freaked out by her, and you're sort of just waiting like for the shoe to drop. And then the second part, they fall in love, and it's just lovely. It's like really hot and just sweet and fun. And then the third part, there's like a really intense twist, and I don't want to spoil it, but it's like all of a sudden all the sort of little pieces of things that haven't quite made sense, that have been floating around the edges, make sense and come together in a, like, to create this like really horrific picture. And yeah, and it's it's so good. It's such a lovely commentary on the sort of, banality of evil, shall we say, the way that normal people going about their everyday lives and just trying their best and not, without any malicious intent, can just absolutely be complicit in the most horrific of horrors. And yeah, and the other thing, which I think felt a little awkward, but like I loved, was that it has this like very sort of like sweet saccharine little ending. And it felt very much like the author just being like, it's okay, little queers, like here's your treat, And anyways, and I needed a treat. And so I loved it. I really can't say that much about this book without spoiling it, but get it, read it, love it. 10 out of 10, Safekeep. Does this video feel like it's been a long video? This feels like it's been a long video. Last one, and it's a short one. My last 10 out of 10, which I don't have a copy of because I lent it to a friend, is Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi. I absolutely loved this book. I think this book is the perfect book if you're like in a reading slump, if you aren't a big reader but want to sort of dip your toe back into reading. It's just absolutely lovely. It is, it's tiny. It's so short. It's less than 100 pages, and the print is really big on the page. It is divided into 4 sections. So it kind of reads like 4 short stories, although the characters overlap and the stories build on each other. So it really, becomes a novel by the end. But, the first short story, for instance, could totally be a standalone short story. And it deals with this coffee shop, this like cute little cozy, vibey coffee shop where there is a magical chair, essentially, and you can sit in the chair and be served a cup of coffee and go back in time, but only in the chair. And you can only go back in time for as long as it takes for your coffee to get cold. You have to like drink the coffee before it gets cold, and when you finish drinking the coffee, you come back to the present. So basically you can spend like 5 minutes in the history of this coffee shop. And so you can, if you've been to the coffee shop before and had significant interactions in the coffee shop, you can go back and revisit those interactions, but you can't change anything about, the outcome or the future. And so it really is just about being able to go back and spend some time in these past interactions and it's about the impact that these interactions have on you, not about any impact you can have on the past. And so the first story is about a woman whose long-term boyfriend, who she thought was going to propose, breaks up with her in this coffee shop. And she, is really hurt and mad and basically blows up at him, and, totally understandably. But as a result, doesn't really get the closure that she wishes she had gotten out of the breakup conversation, because she's just really overcome and shocked and stricken. And, so she isn't in an emotional place to be able to say why, what happened? Can we work through this? Or is this what am I missing? And so she goes back basically just to have that conversation and get that closure. And the other 3 stories are similar. And this book is so wonderful because it perfectly hits the balance of being lovely and cozy and delightful to read, and also wrestling with some quite deep emotional issues. The stories have real punch. Some of them are really sad. And I think that sometimes books, really cozy, vibey books, can, for me, and this is just my perspective, but can be a little too fluffy and too shallow, and the stakes are just really low and nothing really bad happens, or if bad things happen, they're sort of referenced to a thing that happened in the past, but you don't, because the book is doing a cozy thing, it doesn't make you live through any of the the tragedy and the grief and the difficulties. And this book doesn't. You get that sort of emotional complexity and vibrance while the book is also doing this lovely cozy thing. And I think that is a really hard balance to strike. And yeah, it's just a lovely, lovely little book. It may be my favorite book that I read this year. I think of all of these 7 that I really loved, I think Before the Coffee Gets Cold was my favorite. So there you have it. Those are the best books that I read in 2025. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to hear more from me, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you so much for spending some of your one wild and precious life with me watching this video. Happy New Year, guys.